Mayors back to the United States Conference of Mayors meeting in Miami Beach. And taking their seats on the stage, DJ Gribbons of the Trump White House and the Mayor of Los Angeles, California, Eric Garcetti, sitting right over here. How many of you have deferred maintenance somewhere in your infrastructure in the city that you lead? Raise your hand. DJ, take notes here. There's a little bit of deferred maintenance out there somewhere. 65% of America's roads are rated in less than good condition. 25% of our bridges require significant repair or can't handle the necessary traffic. 45% of us lack access to traffic. And of course, you know, the American Society of Engineers completely disregards our infrastructure as being adequate, always giving it failing grades. And Vice President-elect Pence came to our meeting in January and said, we're going to do an infrastructure project, and it's going to be big. We attended the infrastructure briefing at the White House just 2 or 3 weeks ago. President Trump started it off by saying this infrastructure project is going to take off like a rocket ship. And he's charged DJ Gribbon to be the guy that leads that rocket ship. DJ, it's great to have you at the U.S. Conference of Mayors.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Now, in the hierarchy, you report to Mr. Cohn.
That's correct.
Mr. Cohn reports to the President.
That's correct.
So that's not very far removed from like the main source.
It is frighteningly close. If you know me,
yeah.
It's frighteningly close.
We love the support you've given for infrastructure and the creative ideas you presented. I also want to introduce the Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti. A round of applause from the mayors.
Thank you.
I appointed Mayor Garcetti to lead an infrastructure task force, and he didn't waste any time. The moment Trump was elected, Mayor Garcetti was visiting with the administration before they even got their feet planted in Washington. And so I think Mayor Garcetti, as much as any mayor in the country, has been at the forefront of trying to figure out where we go from here. Mm-hmm. Where does the technology lead us? Where do these public-private partnerships lead us? And what types of programs, ideas, and concept is the Trump administration looking for mayors to bring to Washington to create a partnership? So, DJ, with that as kind of the forefront, give us some opening comments.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for having me here today. It's great to be back in a room full of people who own infrastructure. I think as most people in this room can appreciate, the federal government really doesn't own very much infrastructure. We like to regulate it. We'd like to give you sort of thoughtful things that you have to do with your infrastructure, but we actually don't own it. So it's great to be here, and I want to thank Billy Kirkland, who's part of our intergovernmental relations team, who helped coordinate this involvement. We have one of the best intergovernmental relations teams I've ever worked with. He and his partner, Doug Holscher, make sure that we're constantly connected to mayors and to governors. Again, because we want to, as we're formulating our infrastructure package, we want to make sure that we're actually talking to those who own infrastructure. The federal government owns about 8–9% of infrastructure. The rest of it is split relatively evenly between state and local governments and the private sector.
Yeah.
So,
Mayor Garcetti, this is high interest to you. Why?
Yes. Well, thank you, Mick, first of all, for putting me in charge of a task force to look at this on behalf of all of us as mayors in all cities. And DJ, I couldn't be more excited to be working with you, visited with you at the White House, and to have an administration that actually has somebody who's a special assistant just on infrastructure, I believe is a first.
First in history.
And I loved, no matter what side of the campaign you were on in November, I loved that all the candidates were competing with each other to get higher and higher numbers until we landed at $1 trillion, which I'm sure gives you a little bit of a pit in your stomach on some days, but for all of us, we know is even a number that's less than what our country needs. So it's a great start. But, you know, I think for all of us, we know that no matter who's in the White House, the days of cities coming to the White House with an empty hat in hand or to Congress and asking for them to fill it up, they're over. They're long over before this past November. They've been over for many, many years. We've seen federal support kind of whittle down, but the days of us being able to fund everything locally, too, still are not here either. I think all of us would love to be able to do that, but we have different taxing authorities. And what I saw around the country is immediately before President Trump took office is cities like Oklahoma City, Seattle, Los Angeles, Charleston, want to make sure I didn't forget any of the ones, Columbus, Austin, Atlanta, had passed huge infrastructure initiatives. In fact, when we totaled them together, it was $230 billion in one night, almost a quarter of the fabled $1 trillion that both houses and both parties in Congress are talking about and the president talked about. So it was clear to me that we can't do this without the cities and the states being first and foremost at the front of the line. In fact, talking to then President-elect Trump before he was sworn in, he asked me the question, do you think that this should go through cities or states? That's easy for a mayor to answer. Right. I said, the cities, of course, Mr. President-elect. And I still believe that strongly today, even though states have a strong role to play. And in Los Angeles, we've taken that destiny, and we passed a $120 billion initiative just this November on transportation. So it's freeways and roads, local return to the municipalities of the county of LA, and 15 new rapid transit lines, the most ever attempted by one city in US history at the same time. That's on top of an airport we're redoing, second biggest airport in the country, or busiest airport, and the #1 port in the country. All that together wasn't a brag list for me from Los Angeles. It was an example of how cities really are where the power exists on infrastructure. But to also try to impart a message from the U.S. Conference of Mayors to the White House, to the administration, to Congress, we can't do this without you. No. And to anybody who's an ideologue on the left who says, well, anything that says P3 reeks of selling off public goods and only toll roads and other things, we've got to get off that high horse. And anybody on the right who thinks that this is just a matter of banks being able to leverage money when it's relatively cheap has to get off that high horse. And somewhere in between, we need to take the best of public-private partnerships, local money, and federal grants, as well as federal policies that can move things forward to try to accomplish what we're doing in cities. And I'll say one last thing as my opening comments. These moments that we have, I've tried to not talk about infrastructure because I think people's eyes glaze over. You ever say the word infrastructure to constituents, and unless they're engineers or work for one of the great companies that's here, their eyes glaze over. But you talk about their commute and how long they're away from their kids. Yeah. You talk about that bridge that collapsed, a little while away. You talk about what it's like to try to get through an American airport, the quality of the roads that they're on. Once you talk about quality of life on one hand, and then the second thing, jobs, because we're talking about bringing American jobs home. You can't export these jobs. You cannot take them someplace else. These are local middle-class jobs. And when we calculated, those of us in LA County who are here, we passed Measure M. We need a 2/3 vote in California to pass new taxes. We got a 71.5% vote. And that was because we said 500,000 jobs for the next 40 years to kind of replace those old bomber assembly line jobs we used to have in our city, now can be assembling a transit line instead. That really resonated with folks. So I think we have to bring this, cut through kind of the partisanship around this and get something done this year. And I think the U.S. Conference of Mayors wants to play a really strong role in helping that happen.
Fantastic.
DJ, it appears from conversations you and I have had that you believe that when local governments can pass infrastructure initiatives through taxation or through a public-private partnership or somehow create dollars that you want to help incentivize that action. You want to be part of that incentive program. Can you expand on that, give our mayors an idea of what the administration is thinking?
Sure, absolutely. And as Mayor Garcetti touched on, the president said he wanted to generate $1 trillion. Our budget includes $200 billion of new federal spending. And the goal is to use that $200 billion to encourage and incentivize those to follow the example that Mayor Garcetti did in Los Angeles with Measure M. The federal government funds about 16% of infrastructure, and the remainder of that is state and local and the private sector. So the state and locals are doing about 3 times what the federal government is doing. And as Mayor Garcetti touched on, the federal government is just not in a position now, given all the competing demands, from military to health care to education, to come up with the $4 trillion that this American Society of Civil Engineers says is needed for infrastructure of this country. So what we want to do is we're going to keep the existing programs as they are. We're not repurposing the Highway Trust Fund. We're not changing state revolving funds for water. We want to keep those funds flowing. But to the extent that we have an increment above and beyond that, we want to use that increment to create incentives for state and local governments to then raise revenue streams alternatively. And it could be, sales tax like Measure M, could be tolling a road, could be increasing water rates, could be tax benefit assessment districts. Likely we'll be agnostic as to what that is. But the vision is, instead of spending $1 and getting $1 worth of project, that we would spend $1 to hopefully stimulate $5, $6, $10 in new revenue. And that revenue would be used then to pay for the project and also importantly to pay for the maintenance that occurs after the project is built.
Yeah.
We have a bad history here, and in fact, pretty much all governments have a bad history of building things and not adequately maintaining them, so then you have significantly higher reconstruction costs than you would have if you just maintained it appropriately. So that's the general vision. I should say, and caveat my remarks before we get very much further, is we are still in the process of developing our policy as administration. So my job at the NEC is to coordinate the policy process that is basically is every federal agency as it flows up to the president. We don't make decisions, we just help facilitate that process. So this is generally the conversation that we've had, but I should put a little caveat on today's talk that says this is likely to change going forward. General philosophy, I think, will stay in place, but some of the details will move around.
I want to come back to the funding philosophy, but Mayor Garcetti, you've been working with Elon Musk. He has all these really grand ideas about game-changing infrastructure concepts. How many of those do you think are viable, and which one catches your eye that you think someday has a real chance to be implemented in Los Angeles?
Well, I look forward to the U.S. Conference of Mayors being on Mars in a few years. So that one has definitely got great potential. But here, closer to Earth, it's pretty amazing when you look at Elon Musk, who, by the way, was an immigrant to this country. I think he was even an undocumented immigrant when he came here. Somebody who showed the way that he was able to come here, think about changing how we get to the heavens. Now he's looking with Hyperloop, the way that we change on the surface, and now we're working with him on the idea of changing tunneling, which the technology hasn't changed in years, subterranean. So he's really got, heaven, earth, and hell all together covered. But the proposal that we put forward, something called I3, which is what we shared, and I testified on behalf of the U.S. Conference of Mayors to the Senate last month. It's I3. We've heard of P3, this is I3, and the idea is infrastructure, incentive, and initiative. And the reason I bring that in is because Elon kind of gets to that last piece, which is we want to see innovation be a strong piece of what the federal government helps us do. All of us know transportation, for instance, is radically changing, whether it's connected vehicles, whether it's car share, whether it's the possibility of people in unmanned drones. The Jetsons actually, you think it's a joke, but they're testing it this year in Dubai, even though it's American technology, or looking at new ways of tunneling, which Elon Musk has set forward the goal of trying to shorten that tenfold. I think he'll have a problem with the haul routes, but that's a above ground problem. But he called me one day after he tweeted, we want to change the boring technology, put a bunch of his engineers from SpaceX, pulled them off to look at the boring machines that if any of you have ever done big tunnels that you work on. And he said, I got this, I have a hole in the ground, I've started to dig, do I need a permit? So I said, yes, Elon, why don't I come visit? And we did. And the same day he showed that to me was the same day we tested the first 26 teams from around the world, open source on his Hyperloop, not his, it's been out there, but he's one who's promoted it, Hyperloop technology, and the second largest sealed vacuum tube in the world after the Super Collider in Europe. We watched 26 university teams from around the world compete on the same piece of land that Jack Northrop did so much aerospace innovation. So I don't know that I ever bet against Elon. His stuff is always way out there, but it's always kind of come through. He wants those tunnels to be underground in a place like Los Angeles for Tesla cars and other cars to be there. We think probably for public transit. But either way, if you can even cut in half the amount of time it takes to tunnel, we could really look at the acceleration of infrastructure in a lot of our cities, in a lot of the high-speed rail, more transit rail lines that we need, and even potentially cars underground in very congested cities. But I think it requires us to have the leverage of local and federal and private leveraging each other, the innovation, and the last piece is to look at the life of projects. One of the things that we really need help from Washington on is there's certain infrastructure the private marketplace will never build, and too often we like to build things and we don't like to maintain them. And we have to look at ways which we can have reward for those initiatives like we had. Ours is a sales tax that doesn't sunset because we put in there after the construction's done, we're going to have to maintain it. We watch in Washington, D.C., Boston, other places people die or come close to dying in old rail systems that have not been maintained. But we also think that that's an important thing for the feds to give us longer term incentives and even funds to do pieces of that maintenance and reward people who are thinking not just about the short term.
Okay. DJ, let me give you an example of a funding issue, and you can see how it might fit into what you perceive as the partnership between the federal government and local governments. I was talking to the mayor of Green Bay, Wisconsin a while ago. He has deferred maintenance in his system. He believes he could come up with taxation, $10 million a year for 5 years, something like that. He could present that to the Department of Transportation, perhaps send a copy to your office and also to Billy's office representing the local governments. And what would happen then? What would you think that idea might be presented? Would there be negotiation? Would there be questions? What would the next step be if a mayor comes through and puts a proposal in?
Yeah, so again, this is something that we're proposing. We'll need Congress to pass it. Let's assume that all happens, and we now have a law that gives the administration the ability to have some discretion around dollars. So we're not just pushing infrastructure dollars through formula programs. We're going to take those dollars and we're going to spend them deliberately. What would happen is we would probably send out a notice of funding availability that essentially tells everybody in this room and the entire American public, these funds are available for this purpose. And for those of you who are looking forward to a shoving match between me and Mayor Garcetti, you're going to be deeply, deeply disappointed because we're pretty much in complete agreement on these issues, where the federal government would then have a competition around, we have these discretionary dollars. What we want is we want ideas coming from state and local governments that will improve our infrastructure and then leverage that federal taxpayer dollar as high as possible. So in that case, the proposal would come in to the Department of Transportation. To be honest with you, the White House would sort of have no involvement, because our hope is that we would structure this in a way where it would be completely transparent, so that those that submitting the proposal know what's being looked for, how it will be graded. We'll have multiple criteria, which criteria counts more than others, because the point is to have a very, very objective process with very low subjectivity to part of it, so that in essence people will understand what proposal would win and what proposal would not likely win. So that would come in, it would kind of run through a formula, and then depending on what other proposals come in at the same time, may or may not succeed. So that's the thinking, and that would be, primarily a return on investment, both sort of economic and social, where the federal government is looking for ideas that help make sure that the federal taxpayer dollars that are involved in this have the biggest bang for the buck. Now, I should say, if you think about that, what you'll quickly realize is that urban areas will have a huge advantage just because of density. So we're thinking about not only having this leveraging component, where we're creating incentives, but we'll also have a component of the bill that will be focused primarily on rural America, because we understand that the needs in rural America for infrastructure are very different than needs in urban America for infrastructure. And so we're going to be quite deliberate in terms of how we divide that up.
You heard Mayor Garcetti talk about the technology and some of the ideas that Elon has come up with, and you're very aware of them. How might the administration play into funding some of those technologies that might benefit everybody?
So in addition to, good question, so in addition to incentives, in addition to rural America, we're also thinking about funding for transformative projects. Because as the mayor touched on, so in my past life, I worked for an investment bank, and I advised governments on how to attract private equity to projects. One of the challenges you have with projects like high-speed rail, one of the benefits of Elon Musk's tunneling idea, especially on the Northeast where I live, is you can't have high-speed rail in the Northeast because the alignment does this, right? And if you want to go fast, you have to go straight. Well, if you have a tunnel, you can literally just do a straight line from point A to point B. And so it's a very efficient way to use high-speed transportation. The challenge is, as he develops that idea, is you can't go to the commercial market and borrow funds for an untested concept, right? I mean, no commercial bank will give you a loan for something where you literally has never been done before. And I think, if you think back to the interstate highway system, you think back to the Apollo program, that is a very legitimate role for the federal government to step in and say, this is a fantastic concept, but it's got some risks that are difficult to determine, and so we are going to step in and help be a partner of that. And we have actually had some conversations about that with Elon Musk and with others to try to encourage that type of thinking when it comes to infrastructure. The president wants to do something like big and bold that helps people understand that we really are being very aggressive and bringing this country into the 21st century, and we're going to have the best infrastructure in the world.
Yeah. Mayor Garcetti, what do most Americans not really understand about the deferred maintenance of infrastructure? What's out there that people underestimate the size of the issue?
Well, I think we get it for our homes. We know you can't put off infrastructure for too long, or the home falls apart. You got to clean out the gutters. You got to put some new paint on, you've got to do the structural work, but we don't get that as a country in general. And I think they expect all of us, we already have that in our budget. You guys are mayors, don't you already keep that stuff maintained? When a lot of mayors, for financial reasons, we just keep our heads down and hope it doesn't collapse while we're there. You know, the reason we looked at the initiative in Los Angeles, and something interesting I just want to share with you about it, when we polled it, we polled initially our measure M, as a 30-year measure, because there's one that had passed 8 years earlier. And it didn't get to 2/3, which is what we needed. And we said, well, what if it was 40 years and it crept up? And we said, what if it was 50 years and it crept up? And all of you are elected officials, so you know that doesn't happen in our business. And then we said, what if it was permanent? And it was the highest of all the questions we had. So then we did focus groups and we said, what the heck's going on here? And we asked people, why do you think this should be permanent? What the Americans did get is, one person said, and never forget, they said, it's kind of like education. You don't pass a temporary tax for schools. You have property tax for schools, because there's going to be kids, and those kids are going to have kids, and those kids are going to have kids, and you need education always. And they got, at least in the highly trafficked area of Los Angeles, that enough was enough. They didn't want to leave the legacy of just 30 years of things getting a little bit better or not worse in Los Angeles to their children and their children's children. They actually pulled higher when they said it was permanent. And we kind of, as we sold it, did this thing, which is, okay, up at the beginning, you have a lot of infrastructure costs and no maintenance. Over time, you get to nothing else needs to be built, but you have to maintain that. And so there's a steady state of what you need. So Americans might not get with everything, and there's certain things they think just should take care of itself. Pipes, sewage, storm drains, like they don't understand why that takes more investment. But you say, look, even though those pipes last 100 years, it's coming up on 100 years for a lot of us. So we got to figure these things out together. But they did, interestingly, get maintenance, and forever was a smarter way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
DJ, the financial markets, the organizations that run large pension funds, foreign or domestic, how interested are they in infrastructure projects? You know, they have a lot of choices of where to put their money. Where would this fall on their level of interest?
So they are, and this is my former life, they are unbelievably interested in funding infrastructure projects. Because if you think about it, it's primarily pension funds and life insurance funds, where they have long-dated liabilities. They're collecting premiums now, but they know that 20, 30 years out, they're going to have a significant liability to cover for that. And that's where infrastructure comes in, because it's relatively recession-proof. It is stable. The returns tend to be relatively low, but it's very long-dated, stable returns. So there's an organization called Preqin that keeps track of how much dry powder is in these funds. And there's about $108 billion that's today sitting in funds around the world that tomorrow would invest in U.S. infrastructure. And there probably would be a multiple of that if there are more opportunities to invest. So the challenge, though, is some people think, okay, we'll bring private equity in. That's great, because then I don't have to pay for it. And as the mayor touched on, it doesn't really work that way. You still have to pay it, right? The benefit of private equity involved in infrastructure, it benefits the investors significantly. The benefit to the public sector is that you then have built-in maintenance. Well, it tends to drive down your design and construction costs. And then you've in effect, because you're entered into this long-term contract, you've prepaid your maintenance for generations. So you don't have to worry about, will this year's appropriation allow me to pay for maintenance, or do I have to defer that because I have more pressing needs, which invariably happens to every government in the country. So the level of interest in infrastructure is at an all-time historic high. The level of interest in U.S. infrastructure tops the list. So investors are clearly there, ready to invest. They're just looking for opportunities to do so.
Mayor Garcetti, in all your research and polling, what types of infrastructure are citizens more likely to support? Would it be roads, or would it be underground water, or bridges, or airports?
I think it's the ones they interact with the most, which is, for Americans, still roads, first and foremost, or transit in our cities, because they're dealing with the commute and traffic. An airport, some of us go to more frequently than others, but most Americans aren't at the airport regularly, so I think that's a second. Ports, unless you're working one, you don't really think about. And you really don't ever think about the pipes that deliver your water and take the rest of your water out. So I think that is kind of always low. Also low is energy infrastructure, and I know that's something the administration has looked at. I think there's, for all of us that are trying to go to more renewable energy and things like that, we've got to put the infrastructure in to actually carry that power. And that's, I think, a place where the private sector can step in. But and DJ and I have talked about this privately, but I do want to say it publicly too. We can't do this though without federal grants, and we really do know that for some of this stuff, we don't have enough money locally. We couldn't ask people. We would never get enough money and tax them enough to do it all locally. So I don't know how many people have had a Tiger grant in your area. Anybody ever had a TIFIA loan or a New Start? So these ones, which are some of the biggest bang for the buck, we look forward to working with the administration and with Capitol Hill. We've got real bipartisan support on that to do things and to keep them going and develop new ones. I mean, when you're talking about new innovative ways, I think we want old ways of doing new technologies and new ways of doing old infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So if you kind of look at it, what isn't working with the old stuff that we're not getting it done? And as we have new stuff, it's not just going to be Elon the marketplace. We're going to have some pretty old-fashioned kind of approaches to maybe getting a tunnel done. Mm-hmm. I mean, the technology will be new that he'll give us, but we still have to figure out, okay, do we get a line in there that moves people from point A to point B? And I think as long as we keep that leverage in mind and really get beyond the partisanship and say, this is a responsibility that we all have. We can't afford a White House budget that doesn't have it in there. We can't have a local budget that doesn't have it in there. But if we both do, then I think the private sector comes in to accelerate. And that's the last thing I would say is, it's kind of like the home loan. That's what the private sector is. In Los Angeles, where we know 40 years of that plan that we have, I don't want some of the cities that are in my county waiting 32 years to break ground. Some of those mayors in those areas said, I can't support you, Eric, on this. And I understood that because they're like, I'm dead for sure. I'm doing the calculations. I think my kids are dead before this even breaks ground. But the environmental work is basically done. Mm-hmm. So if the money was there, we just can't spend it all at once because we're waiting to come in. They could start this 2 years from now. That's where the private sector comes in. They know that we're good for the sales tax, and we know that it's in our interest because if we wait 32 years, I guarantee you the rate of construction inflation will be much more than the rate of return on bonding that or loaning against it right now.
DJ, you started this conversation by saying the federal government doesn't like to own roads, but we like to regulate them.
We don't like to, but we do.
Well,
yes.
one of the mantras of the Trump administration is to reduce regulation that is slowing down projects, which, as Eric points out, drives up the cost the longer you take. If a mayor out there is dealing with what they feel like is an overreach or some regulation that they'd like some relief from, what do they do? What's your advice?
That is an excellent question. So if you think people's eyes glaze over when you talk about infrastructure, wait till you start talking about permitting reform.
Did you see the map? Did you guys see the map that you're in the White House? If you haven't seen it, you didn't bring one with you, did you?
I didn't. So
he's actually with the president in a press conference.
We had an 8-foot tall schematic of the process that you have to go through to permit a highway, a federal highway in the United States, that involves 10 federal agencies, 16 federal decisions, 24 statutes, 5 executive orders, and it can take up to a decade to get through the entire process. It's an unbelievably convoluted process that we've developed. And so we're attacking that on 3 different levels, actually 4 different levels. The first is legislation. So we're working on a bill right now to make some changes in the statute that fully protect the environment. We want to make sure we're really robust in protecting and carrying out our environmental stewardship responsibilities, but that scale back so we're not doing duplicative work. I was talking to some folks from Alaska where they were doing a pipeline across Alaska, had it fully permitted by the Army Corps of Engineers. And they decided, because the market changed, we want to do an LNG export facility at the end of this pipeline. It's a natural gas pipeline. Well, that falls under FERC. So now it's a FERC process. And so FERC then started over. Instead of just adopting the Corps of Engineers as being a federal decision, they started over from scratch for permitting that pipeline. So one of the things we want to do is make sure that we're changing the statute so that agencies can rely on other agencies. So if the federal government has made a decision on a project, this is how it impacts the environment, that should be one federal decision that other agencies can then just use instead of redoing that work over. So we're doing legislation. Thank you. So we have one
first piece of applause for that.
Exactly.
Was that out there?
One permitting fan. So just to take a step back, when I started, I worked with Reed Cordish, who works with Jared Kushner's group on innovation. And I said, Jared, things I love about government, I would fantasize about sitting in a room, a dozen lawyers, and we're just rewriting these regs so that they're legible, people can understand them, and they're simple. And he stopped me and said, you fantasize about that? I was like, all right, well, you probably called me out of being kind of a permitting reg geek. But it is unbelievably impactful. I mean, we would save $3.6 trillion. We would generate $3.6 trillion in additional economic activity if we could shrink our permitting process from 10 years to 2 years. So we're doing the legislative part, we're doing a regulatory part, we're doing a policy part, and most importantly, we're doing a cultural part, right? We're thinking about how do we re-incentivize federal employees who are touching on the permitting process to focus more on getting the right answer in a quick period of time, as opposed to protecting their individual piece of the pie and delaying the process out. Okay. And so coming up later in July, we're going to be rolling out an announcement that will talk specifically about this, of how it is we, as the Office of the President, can step in and realign the way government agencies, across the federal government, think about permitting, how they work together, who's responsible for what, who's not responsible for what. And then we've also created an office inside the Council of Environmental Quality. This is another first historically, and this office will focus on nothing but permitting. So we'll have, and then we've stood up a new organization called FIPSI, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, that will be responsible for on a project-by-project basis, coordinating all of the agencies, coming up with a timeline, holding people accountable for meeting measurable things, and actually having some penalties, which don't exist currently, if agencies aren't meeting their goals and meeting their timelines. So that organization will be working project by project. Then as they're hitting problems, they're going to feed it into CEQ, where we can make policy adjustments. So if we have two agencies that are just bumping together on the same issue all the time, then the White House can step in, say, all right, now you play second base, you play third base, you're both trying to play shortstop now, and that's not working very well. So I think that this is the most boring thing we'll do, but absolutely the most impactful thing we'll do.
Mayor Garcetti, a couple of minutes, final words. What advice do you have for these mayors who are dealing with deferred maintenance in their system and are looking for a partnership with DJ and his group?
Well, it was interesting. Out in Los Angeles, I hosted about 20 or so local electeds, most of us mayors, but some county and supervisors and some council members that Mayor Hancock and I are both part of Mayor Garcia, this fellowship through the Aspen Institute, half Democrats, half Republicans. We had no staff, no press in there. And when the doors closed, we started talking about what do we do to reform government in this country. And it was fascinating. We're probably 70-30, 80-20, Dem, Republican, kind of, a dissimilar split to here. But all the Democrats, when nobody was there, were saying, gosh, all these things, all these environmental regulations, yeah, we want the clean air, the clean water, but all the well-intended stones we put in this backpack, we can't move, and it's our fault. We need to figure out as Democrats a way to make this quicker. And then the Republican mayors there, one of them said from Rhode Island, I've raised taxes 17 times in 17 years, and they keep re-electing me, and I never have had a tough challenge. And my people love it because they know what they're investing in. And it was this aha moment when it comes to infrastructure for me, that if for a moment we realize that there are things that we can do together on regulatory reform, on shared costs and stepping up, of using the private sector in a good way. On the flip side, if you're Republicans, not to be scared about taxing, not to be scared about the investments, not to be scared about the grants from the federal side, we'd actually move something pretty quickly. We've got, Leader Schumer talking about $1 trillion. He wants 100% of that to be in grants and loans. You've got, folks, I think the Speaker Ryan talked about, leveraging $40 for every $1 the Fed's put in. Okay, neither, in my political opinion, is going to be very realistic, but they're good starting points. And if we can come in and we can be the mayors and say, look, cut the BS, none of us can wait, our people need action, I would say be bold and start where you are. I never, ever thought, I waited 3 years, meeting every few months with all my fellow electeds in LA County on a whole host of issues, but I never dreamed we could have passed Measure M, $120 billion, the largest in US history times 2. In a place you need 2/3. You might say LA's liberal, but 2/3 is not easy to get. And my wingman on this was a Republican member of the Board of Supervisors, a guy named Mike Antonovich, who started the whole process. You can do this, so start local, and the more evidence we have, I think we can help DJ and pressure the administration, pressure Congress to actually produce, because America's people are waiting for this. And if we're going to fall behind the world, develop these technologies, but then let other people actually make the investments, we're not only going to lose jobs, but we're going to see our infrastructure fall apart, and we're going to lose leadership. So now is the time. I think mayors are the place to act, and we can show that loudly and clearly with infrastructure.
DJ, final comments, a couple of minutes.
Final comments, I'm going to continue this pattern of agreeing with Mayor Garcetti, and that is the people in this room are the answer to this problem, right? For two reasons. One, you own a lot of the infrastructure, but more importantly, the public trusts you. There was some polling that was done around the issue of infrastructure, and people will say, yes, I'm willing to spend more on infrastructure. And when asked, what would you rank higher? Infrastructure because it creates 1 million jobs, or infrastructure that's accountable? And accountable scored twice as high as creating 1 million jobs, because Americans understand the need for, and the benefit of good infrastructure, but they are twice as likely to support local initiatives like Measure M than they are to support sending funds to Washington. So the people in this room really are the answer to the solution. And the second thing I would close with is don't give up hope, right? This is a long, arduous process that we're going to go through, especially on the permitting reform side. But you have a president that is a builder, who believes passionately that the current system is not working, and who's sort of tirelessly pinging away at making sure that you're given the freedom and the flexibility and the tools that you need to make America's infrastructure the best in the world.
All right, some direction for tonight. 6 o'clock, Florida mayors have a reception for Mayor Levine. At 7 o'clock, we have our event outside. Wear white if you have it. Because of President Clinton's appearance this weekend, some of the schedules are shifting slightly. Another reminder to get the app so you have the most up-to-date schedule. Otherwise, check with people, check with staff, make sure your schedule's on board. And one round of applause for our guests. Thank you all for coming.